My name is Margaret, and I need to tell you about the day my own children handed me a rental agreement for my own property. Yes, you heard that correctly. My adult children, the same ones I carried for 9 months, raised with love, and sacrificed everything for, actually had the audacity to charge me rent to live in the guest house of the home I've owned for 23 years. I'm 58 years old, and 2 years ago, I lost my husband Robert to cancer. Anyone who's been through that devastating experience knows that grief doesn't just break your heart, it shatters your entire world into a million pieces. After 35 years of marriage, I suddenly found myself alone in a house that felt too big, too quiet, and too full of memories. Around the same time, my 2 adult children were going through their own struggles. My son David, 35 years old, had been unemployed for 8 months after being laid off from his construction job. He was living in a cramped studio apartment, struggling to make ends meet, and frankly, I was worried about him. My daughter Sarah, 32, had just gone through a messy divorce and was trying to rebuild her life with her 7-year-old daughter Emma, my precious granddaughter. As a mother, watching your children struggle is perhaps one of the most painful experiences you can endure. It doesn't matter how old they are, they're still your babies, and you want to protect them from every hardship life throws their way. So when I saw both of my children facing such difficult circumstances, while I was rattling around in this big empty house, the solution seemed obvious. I made them an offer that I thought was generous. No, scratch that. I know it was generous. I told them they could move into the main house rent-free, while I downsized to the guest house on the same property. The guest house is small, but comfortable, 800 square feet with 1 bedroom, a cozy living area, and a kitchenette. It was perfect for a widow trying to start over. And it meant my children and granddaughter could have the space they needed without the financial burden. I covered everything: the property taxes, the utilities, the homeowner's insurance, the maintenance. I even continued buying groceries for the main house because I wanted to make sure Emma had everything she needed. I thought I was being the kind of mother every child deserves: supportive, loving, and sacrificial. For the first few months, they seemed genuinely grateful. David helped with yard work occasionally, and Sarah would invite me over for Sunday dinners. Emma would run over to the guest house after school, and we'd bake cookies together or work on her homework. Those moments felt like healing for all of us. But somewhere along the way, gratitude transformed into entitlement. The occasional help with yard work stopped. The Sunday dinner invitations became less frequent. When I'd walk over to the main house, my own home, I started feeling like an intruder. They'd exchange glances when I'd enter a room, as if I was overstaying my welcome in my own house. They began treating the main house like it was theirs, making decisions about decorating, landscaping, and even utility usage without consulting me. When I gently reminded them that I was still the homeowner, they'd roll their eyes and mutter about how I was being controlling. Then came the conversations about money. Despite living rent-free, they constantly complained about being broke. They'd hint about needing financial help, and like a fool, I'd slip them money for gas, for Emma's school supplies, for whatever crisis had emerged that week. I was bleeding money while they lived comfortably in my home, but I told myself that's what mothers do. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago when David knocked on my door with a folder in his hand and a serious expression on his face. Sarah stood behind him, arms crossed, looking equally stern. They asked if they could discuss some important financial matters with me. I invited them in, made coffee, and sat down, expecting maybe they were finally ready to contribute something toward utilities or groceries. Instead, David opened that folder and slid a piece of paper across my small kitchen table. It was a rental agreement for the guest house, with my name listed as the tenant and their names listed as the landlords. They wanted me to pay them $800 a month to live in the guest house of my own property. But you know what they say about good intentions and the road to hell. Let me take you back to where this nightmare actually began, because understanding how we got here is crucial to understanding just how deeply my own children betrayed me. When Robert died, I thought my world had ended. We'd been married since I was 23 years old, and suddenly I was navigating widowhood at 56, with no roadmap and no preparation. The house we'd built together, filled with 35 years of memories, felt like a mausoleum. Every corner held a ghost of our life together: his favorite reading chair by the window, the kitchen island where he'd make his famous Saturday morning pancakes, the master bedroom where we'd shared our dreams and fears. The grief was suffocating, but what made it worse was watching my children struggle at the exact same time. David had been working construction since he was 18, following in his father's footsteps. He was good at his job, reliable, and took pride in his work. But when the housing market took a downturn, his company started laying people off, and David was among the casualties. At 35, he found himself competing with younger workers for fewer jobs, and his confidence was shattered. Sarah's situation was equally heartbreaking. Her marriage to Tom had been rocky for years, but when she discovered he'd been having an affair with a coworker, the divorce proceedings turned vicious. Tom fought her on everything: custody, alimony, even personal belongings they'd bought. Together, she was working part-time as a dental hygienist while trying to be present for Emma's needs, and the legal bills were drowning her financially. As their mother, watching them struggle while I sat alone in a house with 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms felt not just wasteful, but cruel. The solution seemed so obvious, so perfect. Why should they be scraping together rent money for substandard apartments when I had this beautiful home sitting here? Why should I be lonely and isolated when I could have my family close? The day I made the offer, I remember feeling excited for the first time since Robert's funeral. I called them both over for dinner and laid out my plan. The main house was, there's no rent, no strings attached. They could save money, get back on their feet. And Emma could have a proper yard to play in, instead of being cooped up in some tiny apartment. I would take the guest house, which honestly felt more manageable, for a woman living alone anyway. The gratitude in their eyes that night was everything I needed to see. Sarah actually cried and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. David, who's not typically emotional, got choked up and said I was saving their lives. Emma was thrilled about having a big house and being close to Grandma. It felt like healing, like we were becoming a family again after such a devastating loss. Those first few months were magical. The guest house suited me perfectly: cozy, manageable, and just steps away from my loved ones. David would come knock on my door in the mornings before his job interviews, and we'd drink coffee together while I helped him practice his answers. Sarah would bring Emma over after school, and we'd work on art projects at my small kitchen table. Sunday dinners became a tradition where we'd all gather in the main house, and for brief moments, it almost felt like Robert was still with us. I took care of everything financial, of course. The property taxes alone were nearly $4,000 a year, and the utilities for the main house ran about $300 a month. I paid for lawn care, pest control, and any maintenance issues that arose. When the air conditioning unit needed repair, I covered the $800 bill without question. When Emma needed new school clothes, I took her shopping and footed the bill. I was happy to do it. This is what family does for each other. But somewhere around month 6, the gratitude started fading, and entitlement began creeping in like a poisonous vine. David stopped coming over for morning coffee, claiming he was too busy even though he still hadn't found work. When I'd walk over to the main house to check on something or spend time with Emma, I started noticing subtle changes in how they treated me. They'd be watching television in the living room, and when I'd sit down to join them, David would grab the remote and change the channel without asking what I wanted to watch. When I'd comment on the show he'd chosen, Sarah would give him a look and he'd mumble something about how I could watch whatever I wanted at my own place. At my own place. This was my house. The kitchen became off limits during certain hours. If they were cooking dinner, I was made to feel like I was intruding if I came in to get something from the refrigerator. The refrigerator I was stocking with groceries every week. Sarah started making pointed comments about how I needed to give them some family time when I'd try to help Emma with homework in the evening. They began redecorating without asking. Robert's favorite lamp disappeared from the living room and was replaced with some modern monstrosity Sarah had bought. David painted the guest bathroom without mentioning it to me, choosing a color I absolutely hated. When I expressed concern about these changes, they accused me of being controlling and reminded me that they were living here too. The financial expectations escalated gradually. First, it was hints about how expensive groceries had become. Then, casual comments about the electric bill being higher than expected. Soon, they were directly asking for money for everything from gas to Emma's school supplies to David's job interview clothes. I provided it all because I wanted to help, but I started noticing they never said thank you anymore. These requests became demands, and my generosity became their expectation. The most painful part was how they began treating my presence in my own home like an imposition. If I wanted to use the washer and dryer in the main house, the ones I was paying to Mintai had to ask permission and work around their schedule. If I needed to access the storage room where I kept seasonal decorations or important documents, I was expected to give advance notice, like a tenant requesting access from a landlord. Emma, bless her innocent heart, began reflecting their attitudes. She stopped running to hug me when I came over and would ask me if I had permission from Mommy to be in the main house. My own granddaughter was treating me like a stranger who needed authorization to enter my own home. The breaking point should have come months earlier, but I kept making excuses for their behavior. I told myself they were stressed, that they needed time to adjust, that they didn't really mean to be so dismissive and entitled. I was desperately clinging to the fantasy that my generosity would eventually be appreciated and reciprocated. That's when they crossed a line I never saw coming. I'll never forget the sound of David's knuckles against my door that Tuesday evening. 3 sharp, businesslike knocks, not the casual tap-tap Emma used when she wanted to show me her artwork, or the gentle rhythm Sarah used when she'd come over to chat. These knocks were formal, almost aggressive, and they made my stomach tighten with an inexplicable sense of dread. When I opened the door, both of my children stood on my small porch with expressions I'd never seen before. David held a manila folder against his chest like armor, and Sarah stood slightly behind him with her arms crossed, her jaw set in that stubborn way she'd perfected as a teenager. But this wasn't teenage rebellion, this was something far more calculated and cruel. "Mom, we need to talk," David said without his usual greeting, without asking how my day was, without even stepping inside first. "This is about the living arrangements." I invited them in, my hands trembling slightly, as I cleared some magazines off my small couch to make room. Something in their demeanor told me this wasn't going to be the conversation I'd been hoping for, the one where they finally acknowledged my generosity and perhaps offered to help with expenses. This felt different. This felt dangerous. Sarah declined my offer of coffee with a sharp shake of her head. David sat on the edge of the couch like he was preparing for a job interview, that folder still clutched in his hands. The silence stretched between us until I couldn't bear it anymore. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light despite the growing knot in my stomach. David opened the folder with deliberate precision and pulled out a stack of papers. "We've been doing some thinking about the financial situation here," he began, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, businesslike, cold, almost rehearsed, "and we've realized that this current arrangement isn't working for anyone." He slid the first document across my coffee table. The header read residential lease agreement in bold black letters. Below that, I saw my name listed under tenant and both of their names under landlords. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The words seemed to swim on the page. Tenant, landlords, $800 per month, security deposit required. "What is this?" I whispered, though part of me already knew. Part of me understood exactly what this was, but my mind was rejecting the reality of it. Sarah leaned forward, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd used with Emma when explaining why she couldn't have candy for dinner. "Mom, you've been living here rent-free for almost 2 years now. We've been maintaining the main house, paying for repairs, handling all the upkeep. It's only fair that you contribute something for your housing." The absurdity of her words hit me like a physical blow. "My housing," I repeated, my voice barely audible. "Sarah, this is my property. I own this house. I own this guest. I pay the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, everything." David shifted uncomfortably but pressed on. "That's not really the point, Mom. The point is that we've been providing you with housing services. We maintain the grounds. We handle repairs to the guest house when needed. We've even improved the property value with some of the updates we've made. Updates they'd made without my permission, using materials I'd unknowingly funded in the house I owned." The audacity was breathtaking. "You want me to pay you $800 a month?" I said slowly, picking up the lease agreement with shaking hands, "to live in the guest house of my own property." "It's below market rate," Sarah added quickly, as if she was doing me some tremendous favor. "A 1-bedroom rental in this area goes for at least $1,000. We're giving you the family discount." The family discount. To live in my own home. I stared at the document, reading through terms that treated me like a stranger. There were clauses about noise levels, guest policies, and maintenance responsibilities. There was language about late fees and grounds for eviction. They had turned me, the woman who owned the property, who'd invited them to live there rent-free, out of love and a tenant subject to their authority. We've also calculated what you owe in back rent, David continued, pulling out another sheet of paper. Since you moved into the guest house 22 months ago, at $800 per month, that comes to $17,600, we're willing to accept a payment plan. The room started spinning. Back rent. For living in my own guest house on my own property while supporting them completely. They weren't just asking me to pay going forward, they wanted nearly $18,000 for the privilege of having lived in my own home. I don't understand, I said, though I was beginning to understand all too clearly. Are you saying that all this time, while I've been paying your utilities, your property taxes, buying your groceries, covering your repairs, you think I should have also been paying you rent? You've been getting housing in return, Sarah said, her tone growing defensive. It's a fair trade. Fair trade, as if the 800 square foot guest house was equivalent to me covering every expense for a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house, plus all their living expenses. Where is this coming from? I asked, looking between my children and seeing strangers. Why are you doing this? David and Sarah exchanged a glance, and I caught something in their expressions that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. This wasn't even about money. Not really. This was about power. They had grown comfortable being in control of my home, and now they wanted to formalize that control by making me subordinate to them legally. We need the income, Mom, David said, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. I'm still looking for work. Sarah's got Emma's expenses, and we can't keep living off charity forever. Charity, my generosity, my sacrifice, my love reduced to charity. And somehow, in their twisted logic, the solution wasn't for them to stand on their own feet, but for me to pay them for the privilege of living in my own home while continuing to support theirs. I looked at these people who shared my DNA, who I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and realized I was looking at strangers. Worse than strangers, strangers might show gratitude for kindness. These were people who saw my love as weakness and my generosity as something they were entitled to exploit. I spent 3 sleepless nights wondering where I went wrong as a mother. Those 3 nights were the longest of my life. I lay in my small bed in the guest house, my own guest house on my own property, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the past 2 years. The rental agreement sat on my kitchen counter like a venomous snake, and every time I glanced at it, I felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak that made my chest physically ache. But somewhere in the darkness of that 3rd sleepless night, something shifted. The fog of confusion and hurt began to clear, and I started seeing things with a clarity that was both liberating and devastating. This wasn't really about rent money. This was about power, control, and the systematic exploitation of a grieving mother's love. I began remembering incidents I'd dismissed or rationalized away. Moments that now took on an entirely different meaning when viewed through this new lens of understanding. My children hadn't just become entitled, they had been methodically conditioning me to accept less and less respect while providing more and more resources. Take my car, for instance. About 6 months after they'd moved in, David started borrowing it without asking. I'd wake up in the morning planning to run errands, only to discover my Honda wasn't in the driveway. When I'd call him, confused, he'd act like I was being unreasonable for not remembering that he'd mentioned maybe needing to use it. I told you I might need it for job interviews, he'd say with exasperation, as if my memory was faulty rather than his communication being non-existent. It escalated from there. Soon, Sarah was also taking the car for Emma's activities, doctor appointments, grocery shopping, using my vehicle to run errands while I sat stranded in the guest house. When I gently suggested we establish a schedule, or that they ask before taking it, they made me feel like a selfish grandmother who didn't care about Emma's needs. The money disappearing from my purse was another red flag I'd ignored. Small amounts at first, 20 here, 40 there. When I'd mention it, they'd look genuinely confused and suggest I was misremembering how much I'd had. Mom, you're getting older, Sarah would say with feigned concern. Sometimes people start getting confused about these things. The gaslighting was so subtle, so loving in its delivery, that I actually began questioning my own memory. But it wasn't just about the car or the money. It was about how they'd transformed me from the matriarch of the family into their unpaid servant. When they had dinner parties with friends, I was expected to help cook and clean but not invited to join the actual gathering. It's really more for people our age, Sarah would explain apologetically. as if being 58 made me too decrepit to socialize with people in their 30s. When Emma got sick, I became the automatic caretaker, while Sarah went to work, and David continued his leisurely job search. Don't misunderstand me, I loved spending time with my granddaughter. But there was an assumption, a presumption, that my time was less valuable than theirs, that my role was to be available whenever they needed something. The breaking point should have been when David asked me to clean the main house before his girlfriend came over, not asked, told. Mom, could you make sure the house is presentable? Jenna's coming for dinner tomorrow night, as if I was the housekeeper rather than the woman who owned the property and had been subsidizing his existence for nearly 2 years. I remember standing in my own kitchen, scrubbing counters I'd paid for with money I'd earned, preparing my own home for someone else's romantic evening, and feeling something die inside me. But even then, I told myself it was temporary, that they were still recovering from their setbacks, that this was what families did for each other. The most devastating realization was understanding how calculated their behavior had become. They weren't just thoughtless or entitled, they were strategic. Every boundary they crossed was tested first with smaller infractions. Every demand was preceded by guilt trips about their circumstances or passive-aggressive comments about my expectations. They had studied my weaknesses like scientists. They knew I couldn't bear the thought of Emma suffering, so any resistance from me was framed as harming my granddaughter. They knew I was still grieving Robert and desperate to maintain family connections, so they used that grief as leverage. When I'd push back on anything, they'd remind me how alone I'd be without them, how empty the property would feel, how sad it would be for Emma to lose her grandmother's presence in her daily life. The rental agreement wasn't the beginning of their exploitation, it was the culmination of 2 years of systematic conditioning. They had gradually trained me to accept being treated as a resource rather than a person, as an ATM rather than a mother, as a convenience rather than the woman who'd given them life and was now sustaining their lifestyle. The cruelest part was realizing that my love, genuine, sacrificial, unconditional love, had been weaponized against me. Every act of generosity had been catalogued not as something to be grateful for, but as evidence that I was someone who could be taken advantage of. My grief had been seen not as something deserving compassion, but as vulnerability to be exploited. I understood now that when they looked at me, they didn't see Margaret, the mother, the widow, the woman who'd worked 30 years as a nurse to build the life they were now enjoying. They saw Margaret, the mark, Margaret, the easy target, Margaret, the woman too loving to say no and too heartbroken to fight back. The rental agreement was just their attempt to formalize what had already been happening, making me pay for the privilege of being exploited by my own children. That's when my sister Linda said something that changed everything. Linda arrived on Friday afternoon with a bottle of wine and that no-nonsense expression I remembered from our childhood. My younger sister had always been the tough one, the one who called things as she saw them without sugarcoating anything, for the sake of politeness. At 55, she was still that way, direct, fearless, and absolutely incapable of letting injustice slide by without comment. I hadn't told her about the rental agreement yet. In fact, I'd been avoiding her calls all week because I knew Linda would have opinions, and I wasn't ready to hear them. But when she showed up unannounced, took one look at my face, and demanded to know what was wrong, everything came pouring out. I showed her the lease agreement with trembling hands, watching her face transform from confusion to disbelief to outright fury as she read through the terms. She set the papers down on my coffee table like they were contaminated, and stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Margaret," she said slowly, her voice dangerously quiet, "please tell me you didn't sign this." "Of course not," I replied quickly. I told them I needed time to think about it. Time to think about it. Linda's voice rose several octaves. Time to think about whether you should pay your own children rent to live in your own guest house, on your own property, while you support their entire existence. When she put it like that, it sounded even more insane than it had felt living through it. But I found myself defending them anyway, the way abused people often defend their abusers. They're struggling, Linda. David can't find work, and Sarah's still dealing with the divorce fallout. They're just trying to find a way to make ends meet. Linda stood up abruptly and walked to my kitchen window, the one that looked directly at the main house, my main house where my children were living, rent-free, while demanding I pay them for shelter. "Margaret, look at me," she said, turning back with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "What you just described to me isn't struggling children asking for help. This is financial abuse. This is emotional manipulation. This is exploitation of the cruelest kind because it's being done by the people you love most. That's a little dramatic, is it? Linda interrupted. Let me paint you a picture of what I see here. You're a 80-year-old widow who lost her husband 2 years ago. Instead of taking time to grieve and figure out your own life, you immediately opened your home and your wallet to adult children who should be taking care of themselves. You've been paying their housing, their utilities, their food, their repairs, their emergencies, and God knows what else, for 2 years. She started pacing my small living room like a lawyer making her case. In return, they've gradually isolated you from your own home, made you feel like an intruder in your own property, taken your car without permission, stolen money from your purse, and now they want you to pay them for the privilege of continuing to be their victim. The word victim hit me like a slap. I'm not a victim, Linda. I'm their mother. You're both, she said gently, sitting back down beside me. And that's exactly why this is so devastating. They're using your love against you, Margaret. They're using your grief, your loneliness, and your maternal instincts as weapons to exploit you financially and emotionally. I felt tears starting to form, but Linda wasn't finished. Do you know what normal adult children do when their widowed mother offers them temporary help? They say thank you every single day. They contribute whatever they can. They respect her home and her boundaries. They work their asses off to get back on their feet so they can stop being a burden. They don't colonize her property and then charge her rent to live in her own guest house. But their family know, Margaret, family doesn't treat family this way. What David and Sarah are doing to you isn't family behavior, it's predatory behavior. They've identified you as someone who won't fight back, someone whose love can be exploited indefinitely, and they're milking that for everything it's worth. The brutal honesty of her words was like ice water on my face. I wanted to argue, to defend my children, but deep down I knew she was right. Think about it, Linda continued. They moved into your house temporarily to get back on their feet. 2 years later, not only are they still there, but they've somehow convinced you that you owe them money. How does that make any logical sense? I couldn't answer because it didn't make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense when viewed from the outside. Margaret, they're squatting on your property while demanding you pay them rent. If strangers did this to you, you'd call the police. But because they came out of your womb, you're sitting here wondering if maybe you should just pay up and keep the peace. She picked up the rental agreement again and shook it at me. This isn't about rent, and it's not about money. This is about control. They want to make you their tenant so you'll never again have the authority to set boundaries or make demands. Once you sign this, you become subordinate to them legally, and they can treat you however they want. Linda handed me a business card and said, "Call him tomorrow, or live like this forever." The business card Linda had pressed into my hand belonged to Robert Chen, an attorney specializing in elder law and family legal issues. His office was in a sleek downtown building, and as I sat in the elegant waiting room the following Monday morning, I felt simultaneously nervous and determined. The rental agreement was tucked in my purse like evidence of a crime which, as I was about to learn, wasn't far from the truth. Robert Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a demeanor that immediately put me at ease. When I explained why I was there, pulling out the lease agreement my children had presented, his expression shifted from professional interest to barely contained outrage. He read through the document twice before looking up at me with a mixture of disbelief and anger that mirrored what I'd seen on Linda's face. "Mrs. Patterson," he said carefully, "I need to make sure I understand this correctly. You own the property in question, both the main house and the guest house. You invited your adult children to live in the main house rent-free as a temporary arrangement to help them get back on their feet. And now they're demanding that you, the property owner, pay them rent to live in your own guest house." "That's correct," I replied, feeling slightly embarrassed even though I knew I wasn't the one who should be ashamed. "Have you been paying rent anywhere else? Do you have another residence?" "No. This is my only home. I moved to the guest house so they could have more space in the main house." Robert leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Patterson, what your children are attempting to do isn't just morally reprehensible, it may actually be illegal. This could constitute financial elder abuse under state law." The words elder abuse sent a chill through me. I wasn't ready to think of myself as elderly, but I understood what he meant. "Let me explain your legal position," he continued, pulling out a legal pad. You are the sole owner of this property. Your children are what we call permissive occupants. They're living there with your permission, but they have no legal rights to the property whatsoever. They cannot charge you rent for your own property any more than you could charge them rent to use their own toothbrushes. He leaned forward, his tone becoming more intense. Furthermore, the fact that they're attempting to collect what they call back rent for the time you've lived in your own guest house could be considered attempted fraud. They're trying to collect money they have no legal right to collect for services they never provided. I felt a surge of validation hearing someone with legal expertise confirm what my gut had been telling me. What they're doing, Robert continued, is taking advantage of your generosity and grief to establish control over your property and finances. This is a textbook case of financial exploitation of a vulnerable person. So what are my options? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Robert's expression grew strategic, and I could see the wheels turning in his legal mind. We have several approaches available, but I recommend what I call the mirror strategy. If your children believe so strongly in rental agreements and fair market compensation for housing, then let's give them exactly what they're asking for. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began sketching out a plan that was both brilliant and ruthless. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a legitimate rental agreement for the main house, the house they're currently living in, rent-free. We'll research comparable rental rates in your area and draft a proper lease agreement at fair market value. He paused to look up rental comps on his computer, typing in my address and property details. A 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house in your neighborhood, with the square footage and amenities your property offers. Rents for approximately $2,800 per month, he said, turning his monitor so I could see the listings. We'll draft a lease agreement for that amount, plus utilities, plus a security deposit equal to 2 months' rent. The numbers were staggering. I'd been covering their housing, utilities, and countless other expenses, but seeing the actual market value laid out in black and white was eye-opening. We'll also include standard tenant responsibilities, property maintenance, yard care, minor repairs, keeping the property in good condition. And here's the beautiful part, we can make it retroactive to when they first moved in. My eyes widened. Retroactive, absolutely. If they want to play the rental game, then we play by rental rules. They've been living there for 22 months at $2,800 per month. Plus utilities averaging $300 per month. That's $68,000 in back rent, plus approximately $6,600 in utilities. I felt dizzy. $74,600, that's what I'd provided them in housing costs alone, not including groceries, repairs, and all the other expenses I'd covered. What if they refused to sign? I asked. Robert's smile was sharp and professional. Then we proceed with eviction proceedings immediately. As the property owner, you have the absolute right to terminate their permission to occupy your property. In most cases like this, we can have them out within 30 to 60 days. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos of similar cases he'd handled. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to understand something crucial. Your children are counting on your maternal instincts to prevent you from taking action. They're banking on the fact that you'd rather be exploited than risk conflict with them. But what they're doing to you is wrong, and it's legally actionable. He leaned across his desk, his expression serious but encouraging. You have all the power here. You own the property. You've been supporting them financially for 2 years. They have contributed nothing except entitled behavior, and now outright attempted extortion. The law is entirely on your side. For the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: hope. Not just hope, but actual excitement about taking control of my own life again. When can we start? I asked. I can have the rental agreements drafted by Thursday. We'll present them with the same formal approach they used with you: serious, businesslike, non-negotiable. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd found my backbone again. The rental agreements Robert had prepared were works of art, professional, comprehensive, and absolutely bulletproof. I spent Thursday evening reading through every clause, every term, every condition, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in 2 years. These weren't the hastily scribbled demands my children had presented to me. These were legitimate legal documents that would hold up in any court of law. I decided to mirror their approach exactly. Just as they had knocked on my door that Tuesday evening with their folder and their serious expressions, I would present their rental agreements with the same formal precision. But, unlike their amateur attempt at exploitation, My documents were backed by legal expertise and moral authority. Friday evening, I called them both and asked them to meet me in the main house living room. My living room at 7 o'clock sharp. I specified that this was regarding the rental situation and that both of them needed to be present. The anticipation in their voices was almost amusing. They clearly thought I was ready to capitulate and sign their ridiculous agreement. I arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio Robert had provided, wearing my best navy blazer and the pearl necklace Robert, my husband, had given me for our 20th anniversary. If we were going to play business, I was going to look the part. David and Sarah were already seated on the couch, looking relaxed and confident. Sarah was actually smiling, and David had that smug expression he'd worn as a teenager when he thought he'd gotten away with something. Emma was thankfully at a friend's house, sparing her from witnessing what was about to unfold. "Thank you both for making time for this meeting," I began, settling into the armchair across from them with deliberate formality. "I've given considerable thought to your proposal regarding rental agreements, and I've come to a decision." Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "That's wonderful, Mom. We knew you'd see that this arrangement makes sense for everyone." "Oh, I absolutely agree that rental agreements make perfect sense," I replied, opening my portfolio with practiced calm. "In fact, I was so impressed with your business-minded approach that I decided to apply the same logic to the entire property." I pulled out the first set of documents, beautifully bound copies of a comprehensive lease agreement prepared by Chen and Associates. "Since you've convinced me that family members should pay fair market rent for their housing, I've had proper rental agreements drawn up for the main house." The confidence on their faces began to waver as I slid the documents across the coffee table. David picked up his copy first, and I watched his expression change as he read the header: Residential Lease Agreement Tenants, David Patterson and Sarah Martinez. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice already losing its cheerful tone. "It's exactly what you requested," I replied smoothly. "A fair, legal rental agreement based on market rates and standard tenant responsibilities." I researched comparable properties in the area, and a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house with the square footage and amenities. "This property offers rents for $2,800 per month." David's head snapped up. $2,800. That's the fair market rate, which is what you said you believed in when you presented me with your rental proposal for the guest house. I've also included utilities, which average $300 per month for a property this size, plus a security deposit equal to 2 months' rent, $5,600. The color was draining from Sarah's face as she flipped through the pages. "Mom, this is insane. We can't afford—" "Oh, but there's more," I interrupted gently, pulling out the second document. "Since you mentioned back rent in your proposal for the guest house, $17,600, I believe it was. I've calculated what you owe for the main house using the same methodology." I handed them the accounting summary Robert's office had prepared. The numbers were laid out in neat columns: 22 months of occupancy at $2,800 per month, plus utilities, totaling $74,600 in back rent. The silence in the room was deafening. David stared at the numbers like he was trying to make them disappear through sheer force of will. Sarah's mouth was opening and closing without sound. "This is ridiculous," David finally managed. "We're your children. We're family." "Exactly the same argument I made when you presented me with a rental agreement for my own guest house," I replied calmly. "But you explained to me that family relationships don't exempt anyone from fair business practices." I found that perspective quite enlightening. Sarah found her voice, though it was pitched higher than normal. "You can't be serious about this. Where would we get that kind of money?" "The same place you expected me to get $800 a month plus back rent," I answered. "I'm sure you'll figure something out. After all, you've both had 22 months of rent-free living to save money and get your finances in order." I pulled out the final document, a payment plan option that Robert had suggested with a wicked gleam in his eye. "Of course, I understand that $74,000 is a substantial amount, so I'm prepared to offer the same consideration you offered me, a payment plan. You can pay the back rent in monthly installments of $1,200, in addition to your ongoing rent of $3,100 per month going forward." David's face had gone from pale to flushed. $4,300 a month total. "Mom, that's impossible. You know we don't have that kind of money." "I'm curious about that," I said, tilting my head thoughtfully. "If you don't have money for rent, where exactly did you think I was going to get $800 a month for the guest house? I'm a widow on a fixed income, not exactly rolling in disposable cash. The hypocrisy was hanging in the air like smoke, and we could all smell it. Sarah tried a different approach, her voice taking on the wheedling tone she'd perfected as a child. Mom, come on, this is different. We're struggling. You know that. David's still looking for work, and I'm barely making ends meet with Emma's expenses. And yet you felt comfortable asking me to pay rent while covering all your living expenses, I replied. Interesting how that works. I stood up, smoothing my blazer, and delivered the final blow. You have 72 hours to review these documents and provide your decision. You can sign the rental agreements and begin making payments, or you can vacate the property. Those are your only options. David shot to his feet, his face now bright red. You can't do this. You can't just kick us out. Actually, I can, I said pleasantly. I'm the property owner, and you're occupying my property at my discretion. That discretion can be revoked at any time with proper notice, which I'm providing now. I walked toward the door, then turned back with a smile. Oh, and David, the lease includes standard maintenance responsibilities, so you'll need to handle lawn care, minor repairs, and property upkeep going forward. I thought you'd appreciate having clearly defined expectations. You should have seen their faces when they realized Mama didn't raise a fool. The explosion came exactly 18 hours after I'd presented them with the rental agreements. I was in my kitchen Saturday morning, peacefully drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, when the pounding on my door began. Not knocking, the kind of aggressive hammering that makes neighbors peer through their curtains and consider calling the police. I opened the door to find both of my children standing there in various states of dishevelment. Sarah's hair looked like she'd been running her hands through it all night, and David's face was blotchy with rage. Behind them, I could see Emma in the main house yard, playing alone while her mother and uncle prepared to have a public meltdown. We need to talk, David said, pushing past me into my small living room without invitation. This stops now. Please, come in, I said dryly, closing the door behind Sarah, who was clutching the rental agreements like they were contaminated evidence. The next 30 minutes were perhaps the most enlightening of my entire relationship with my adult children. I watched them cycle through every stage of manipulation and emotional blackmail in their arsenal, revealing exactly who they'd become when their comfortable exploitation was threatened. Denial came first. Of course, this is insane, Sarah declared, waving the contracts in the air. These numbers are made up. No one pays $2,800 for rent around here. I pulled out my phone and showed her the real estate listings Robert had used for comparison. Actually, these are 3 comparable properties within a 2-mile radius. Would you like me to call the leasing offices so you can verify the rates yourself? She knocked my phone away from her face. I don't care what some stupid website says. This is our family home, not some random rental property. You're absolutely right, I agreed. It is our family home. My family home, which I've been allowing you to live in rent-free for nearly 2 years, while you demanded I pay you for the privilege of living in my own guest house. David tried a different approach. Mom, you're being manipulated by that lawyer. He's obviously trying to rack up billable hours by creating family drama. Can't you see that? The irony was stunning. The man who'd tried to charge me rent for my own property was now accusing my attorney of manipulation. When denial failed, anger took center stage, and it was uglier than I'd ever seen from either of them. You're destroying this family, Sarah screamed, her face turning an alarming shade of red. Emma's going to grow up thinking her grandmother is a heartless bitch who cared more about money than her own grandchild. The cruelty of using Emma as a weapon was breathtaking, but I'd learned to expect this kind of manipulation from them. Emma's going to grow up watching her mother take responsibility for her own life instead of exploiting elderly relatives, I replied calmly. I think that's a much better lesson. David's approach was more calculating but equally vicious. You know what, Mom? You want to play hardball? Fine. I'm going to post this whole situation on social media. Let's see how your friends at church feel when they find out you're trying to make your own children homeless. He pulled out his phone and started typing. I'm thinking something like, my mother's trying to charge us $74,000 in back rent for helping her out after Dad died. Please share this so people can see what kind of person she really is. The threat was designed to terrify me, to make me back down out of fear of public embarrassment. Instead, I found myself laughing. Please do, I said. Make sure you include The part where you tried to charge me $800 a month to live in my own guest house while I paid all your bills. I'm sure people will find that very interesting." His typing slowed as he realized his social media strategy might backfire spectacularly. Sarah tried the emotional manipulation route next, complete with tears that I was no longer certain were genuine. "How can you do this to us?" she sobbed. "After everything we've been through, after losing Dad, after all the struggles we've had, how can you turn on your own children like this?" "Sarah," I said gently, "I opened my home to you when you were struggling. I paid every expense, covered every bill, supported you completely for 2 years. In return, you gradually treated me with less and less respect until you finally tried to charge me rent to live in my own home. Who turned on whom?" The tears dried up remarkably quickly when she realized they weren't working. Then came the bargaining phase, and this was almost entertaining to watch. "Okay, fine," David said, suddenly switching to a reasonable tone. "Maybe we got a little carried away with the guest house thing. Let's just forget about all of this, your lease, our lease, all of it. We'll go back to how things were before." "How things were before," I repeated. "You mean where you lived rent-free in my house, used my car without permission, took money from my purse, treated me like hired help, and gradually isolated me from my own home?" "We never," Sarah started to protest. "You absolutely did," I interrupted, "and the rental agreement you presented to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the natural progression of 2 years of increasing entitlement and exploitation. When bargaining failed, they moved to threats, and this was where their true colors really showed." "Fine," David snarled. "But don't think this ends here. We'll fight you on this. We'll get our own lawyer. We'll claim elder abuse, you forcing your children out of their home because you're not mentally competent to make these decisions." The audacity was breathtaking. They were threatening to claim I was mentally incompetent for refusing to pay them rent to live in my own home. "I welcome that challenge," I said. "My attorney is very experienced in elder abuse cases, and he's quite confident about who the actual abuser is in this situation." Sarah's final attempt was pure emotional terrorism. "You're going to lose Emma," she said with cold calculation. "If you do this, if you force us out, you'll never see your granddaughter again. Is that what you want? To die alone because you cared more about money than family?" The threat to cut me off from Emma was designed to be the killing blow, the thing that would make me crumble and give them whatever they wanted. And it did hurt deeply. But it also revealed something crucial about who Sarah had become. "Sarah," I said quietly, "you just threatened to use your daughter as a weapon to emotionally blackmail me into accepting financial abuse. Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you just said?" For a moment, she looked genuinely shocked, as if she was hearing her own words from an outside perspective. But the moment passed quickly, and the entitled mask slipped back into place. "Whatever," she said dismissively. "You've made your choice. Don't come crying to us when you're sitting alone in this house wondering where your family went." They stormed out, slamming my door so hard that a picture fell off the wall. Through my window, I watched them march back to the main house, Sarah gesturing wildly while David kicked at the gravel in my driveway. I sat back down at my kitchen table and finished my coffee in blessed silence. They had 30 days to sign or vacate, and I was counting down every single one. The 30-day deadline came and went without so much as a phone call from David or Sarah. No signature on the rental agreements. No payment plan proposal. No attempt at negotiation. They had chosen to ignore my ultimatum entirely, apparently believing that their mother wouldn't have the backbone to follow through on her threats. They were about to learn how wrong they were. On day 31, Robert Chun's process server appeared at the main house door with official eviction papers. I watched from my kitchen window as David answered the door in his pajamas at 10 in the morning, his face shifting from confusion to rage as he realized what he was being handed. The server explained the legal process calmly and professionally, while David's voice grew louder and more belligerent. Within an hour, my phone started ringing. The first call came from David, his voice shaking with fury. "You actually did it. You actually filed eviction papers against your own children. I told you exactly what would happen if you didn't sign the rental agreements." I replied calmly. "You chose to ignore the deadline. This is insane. We're family. You can't just throw us out on the street. You're adults who have been living rent-free in my house for 2 years while demanding, I pay you for the privilege of living in my own guest house," I said. "The only insane thing is that it took me this long to enforce my property rights." He hung up on me, but the calls kept coming. Sarah tried the guilt trip approach. Emma's crying, "Mom, she doesn't understand why Grandma wants to make us homeless. How am I supposed to explain to a 7-year-old that her grandmother cares more about money than family?" The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. "Sarah, Emma is crying because her mother has spent 2 years teaching her that exploitation is normal family behavior. Instead of getting her life together and providing stability, we needed time to recover. 2 years, Sarah, 2 years of free housing, free utilities, free groceries, free everything. And what do you have to show for it? David's still unemployed, and you tried to charge me rent to live in my own home. That's not recovery, that's parasitism." She hung up too. But by then, their social media campaign had begun. David's first Facebook post appeared that afternoon. "My widowed mother is trying to evict her own children and granddaughter because she'd rather have money than family. Please share this so people can see what greed does to families." Within hours, Sarah had posted her own version, "Homeless with my daughter because my mother decided we weren't worth keeping around. Apparently, we were just a burden she wanted to get rid of." The posts were designed to paint me as a heartless monster, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had forgotten that truth has a way of coming out, especially when you're desperate enough to air your family's dirty laundry in public. The first crack in their narrative came from my nephew Jake, Linda's son, who commented on David's post, "Wait, aren't you living in Aunt Margaret's house? Why would she need to evict you if you're paying rent?" David's response was telling. "It's complicated. She's not thinking clearly since Dad died." But Jake pressed further. "I was just there last month, and you guys said you were living there rent-free while she lived in the guest house. What changed?" That's when other family members started asking questions, and the whole story began unraveling in the most public way possible. My cousin Rita, who had always been direct, commented, "David, are you seriously complaining about being evicted from a house you weren't paying for? What exactly did you expect?" Sarah tried to control the narrative by posting about how they'd been helping maintain the property and supporting their grieving mother. But Linda shut that down immediately with a comment that went viral within our family circle. "Supporting her. You tried to charge Margaret rent to live in her own guest house while she paid all your bills. That's not support, that's exploitation." The social media strategy that was supposed to rally sympathy for them instead became a public education campaign about their entitled behavior. Family members started sharing their own stories in the comments, how David had borrowed money and never repaid it, how Sarah had expected free babysitting without reciprocation, how they'd both become increasingly demanding and ungrateful over the years. My church friends, who David and Sarah thought would be horrified by my heartlessness, instead rallied around me with support and outrage on my behalf. Betty Henderson, the pastor's wife, posted a comment that summed up the general sentiment. "Margaret Patterson is one of the kindest, most generous women I know. If she's evicting her own children, they must have done something truly awful to push her to that point." The coup de grace came when my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had witnessed months of my children's entitled behavior, posted her own comment. "I've watched these children treat Margaret like hired help while living in her house for free. I've seen them take her car without asking and heard them complaining about her to visitors. The only surprise is that she put up with it for so long." As the truth spread, David and Sarah's posts began attracting the wrong kind of attention. Instead of sympathy, they were getting criticism from people who recognized their behavior for what it was. The narrative of heartless mother throws out struggling children was being replaced with entitled adults finally face consequences for exploiting widowed mother. In desperation, they began deleting comments and eventually took down their posts entirely, but screenshots had already been shared, and the damage to their credibility was complete. The legal process moved forward with mechanical precision. Robert filed all the necessary paperwork, and the court date was set for 3 weeks later. David and Sarah made one last attempt to negotiate, showing up at my door with Emma, their own daughter, as a prop in their manipulation attempt. "Mom, please," Sarah said, holding Emma's hand while the child looked confused and uncomfortable. "Don't make Emma homeless. She didn't do anything wrong." "You're absolutely right," I replied. "Emma didn't do anything wrong. That's why I've set up an account for her college fund with the money I'm no longer spending on your rent-free lifestyle. She'll be fine once her mother starts acting like a responsible adult." The court hearing was almost anticlimactic. The judge reviewed the evidence, my property ownership, the documented history of their rent-free occupancy, and their attempted extortion via the guest house rental agreement and granted the eviction order with barely contained disgust at their behavior. 30 days, he said firmly, and I suggest you use that time to find employment and housing like any other adults would. Moving day arrived, and Karma had a front row seat. Moving day arrived on a crisp October morning, and I positioned myself at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee and a sense of profound satisfaction. After nearly 3 months of legal proceedings, threats, manipulation, and public drama, justice was finally being served with mathematical precision. The moving truck David had rented was embarrassingly small, a testament to how little they'd actually accumulated during their 2 years of rent-free living. I watched Sarah direct the movers with frantic gestures while David sulked around the property, occasionally shooting resentful glances toward my guest house. Emma sat on the front steps looking lost and confused, an innocent victim of her mother's poor choices. What struck me most was how unprepared they were for this moment. Despite having months to plan, despite knowing this day was inevitable, they were scrambling like teenagers who'd forgotten about a major assignment until the night before it was due. Sarah kept running back into the house for one more thing, while David argued with the movers about charges he clearly hadn't budgeted for. The irony wasn't lost on me. These were the same people who'd tried to present themselves as responsible adults capable of being my landlords, yet they couldn't even organize their own move efficiently. Linda arrived around noon with sandwiches and moral support, positioning herself beside me at the window like we were watching the world's most satisfying reality show. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though my expression probably answered the question. "Free," I replied without hesitation. For the first time in 2 years, I feel genuinely free. And it was true. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months, the constant anxiety about their next demand, their next manipulation, their next attempt to make me feel guilty for owning my own property, had lifted completely. I was no longer walking on eggshells in my own home, no longer second-guessing every decision, no longer enabling their destruction of my peace and financial security. By late afternoon, the truck was loaded and David was conducting a final walkthrough of the main house with a checklist, probably hoping to find damage he could blame on me to avoid returning the security deposit he'd never actually paid. I'd already had the property professionally cleaned and inspected, so his petty attempt at revenge was doomed to failure. Sarah made one final approach to my door, this time without Emma as a human shield. Her face was streaked with tears this time, I thought, born of genuine fear about her uncertain future rather than calculated manipulation. "Mom," she said quietly, "I know things got ugly between us, but you're really going to let your only daughter be homeless?" The question revealed everything that was still wrong with her thinking. Even now, facing the consequences of her actions, she saw herself as a victim rather than an adult who'd made poor choices. "Sarah," I said gently but firmly, "you're not homeless because of me. You're facing housing insecurity because you spent 2 years living rent-free instead of saving money and getting your life together. You're in this position because you chose to exploit my generosity rather than use it as a stepping stone to independence." She opened her mouth to argue, but I continued. "More importantly, you're not homeless. You have options. You can get a full-time job. You can find a roommate. You can rent a place within your means. You can apply for assistance programs. What you can't do anymore is live off your widowed mother while treating her like hired help." The tears continued, but I felt no urge to comfort her. Compassion and enabling are 2 different things, and I'd finally learned the difference. After they left, I walked through the main house slowly, reclaiming my space room by room. They'd left it reasonably clean, though I noticed they'd taken some items that belonged to the house, a few kitchen appliances, some decorator pieces Robert and I had collected over the years, small thefts that spoke to their sense of entitlement even in defeat. But the house felt different now. It felt like mine again. That first night back in my master bedroom was transformative. I'd forgotten how much I'd missed the space, the familiarity, the sense of belonging in my own home. For 2 years, I'd been a guest in my own life, accommodating other people's schedules and preferences in the property I'd worked 30 years to pay for. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Without the constant drain of supporting 2 adult children and a granddaughter, my monthly expenses dropped dramatically. The money I'd been hemorrhaging on their groceries, utilities, car insurance, and various emergencies was suddenly available for my own needs and wants. I redecorated the house to my taste for the first time since Robert's death, choosing colors and furniture that made me happy rather than trying to accommodate everyone else's preferences. I joined a book club at the library and started taking a pottery class at the community center. For the first time in years, I had time and energy for my own interests. 6 months later, Linda convinced me to try online dating. Margaret, she said over lunch at our favorite cafe, "You're 58, not 8. You've got decades of life ahead of you. Why not share some of it with someone who actually appreciates you?" The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I'd been so focused on being needed by my children that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted by someone who chose to be in my life rather than someone who felt entitled to my resources. I've been seeing James for 3 months now. He's a retired teacher, widowed, like me, with adult children who visit regularly but live their own lives responsibly. Our relationship is refreshingly uncomplicated to mature adults who enjoy each other's company without drama, manipulation, or hidden agendas. When James learned about what David and Sarah had put me through, his response was immediate and clear. "Good for you for standing up to them." Too many parents enable their adult children out of misplaced guilt, and it destroys everyone involved. As for David and Sarah, the separation has been educational for all of us. David finally found employment motivated by actual necessity for the first time in years. Sarah moved in with a roommate and increased her work hours to full-time. They're both discovering what it means to be genuinely independent adults, something they should have learned a decade ago. Emma and I maintain contact through carefully orchestrated visits that don't involve her mother's manipulation or demands for financial support. I take her to lunch once a month and help with school supplies when appropriate, but always directly through the school rather than through Sarah's hands. The relationship with my children remains strained, and it may never fully recover. But I've come to understand that a relationship based on exploitation isn't really a relationship at all. It's just a transaction disguised as love. I sleep peacefully in my own house now, surrounded by my own choices and my own rules. I spend my money on things that bring me joy rather than enabling other people's dysfunction. I make decisions based on what's best for my own well-being rather than what will keep other people from being angry with me. The greatest gift I gave my entitled adult children was the opportunity to finally grow up and become the people they were always capable of being. And the greatest gift I gave myself was the courage to reclaim my own life. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well in your own house, on your own terms, with your own rules.